welcome to the New Video Frontiers Identity panel. Today we're going to talk about what the emerging identity options are for both buyers and sellers in CTV. But before we talk about the subject, it's useful to get some context. As we know, the ICO resumed its investigation into RTB and announced that last week. But on the flip side, the Trade Desk Unified ID 2.0 has its first CTV platform, Fubo TV. At the end of last year, Freewheel bought Beeswax, and just last week, Magnite bought SpotX. In addition, recent research from the Winterby Group showed that 50% of UK brands surveyed, and this isn't just brands using CTV, it's across all of digital, had used a clean room to support marketing efforts. And that rises to 60% for brands in the US. And also there's a lot of collaboration. So France Television, M6 and TF1 join forces for Sigma in France, which allows certified DSPs to buy VOD with first-party data programmatically. And D-Force in Germany, which is a JV between 7one Media and RTL. And from one of our panelists here, we have ITV recently announcing that Samsung Ads is the first external publisher to join Planet V. What about Belle, from an agency point of view? What's your point of view, and how do you view and consider identity in CTV?
I think really we look at it through a similar lens, but slightly differently to a publisher. Whilst publisher is all around like content consumption beyond the ad, for us, we try and tie it back to what is a brand or one of our clients trying to achieve within their advertising as a different lens. So for us, identity relates to three different core areas. So the first of all being the most obvious, which is targeting. So how do we make sure that we get the right ad in front of the right person at the right time? The second is really looking at effectiveness and measurement. So how do we prove that that media had an incremental effect in that overall purchase journey? Did it add value? Did it not? And then the third thing is, how do we use those signals to make better media decisions, to get the most out of the media budgets that we spend with each provider? And therefore, identity for us isn't just about necessarily the end person, but it's a variety of different signals related to user behavior and who a user might be. This includes, for example, location. Location might be really important to some of our clients because of where they can deliver different services and capabilities. And that for us is a really good identity signal, even though we can't trace it back to necessarily a person. Equally, there are other clients that really care about the individual and making sure that we can tie that individual across the ecosystem. I think there's so much opportunity in this space when it comes to connected TV. And when we're talking about connected TV, we're not just talking about stuff that we can buy through, for example, Hub. It's the linear TV opportunities as well. And it goes beyond that also to start looking at what are also gaming opportunities on big screen, for example. So there's lots of really exciting opportunity here. And I think you mentioned really nicely a point where there's more opportunity emerging here than there's potentially the close down of the open market from a digital space. And this is why I think you're going to see that growth within the area, is because we're moving away from that traditional buying of ABC ones to actually being able to understand and identify new opportunities, new media, and that's where budgets might shift and change.
Okay, thanks. So in effect, there's the sort of use cases that third-party cookies would have solved for in traditional media, but potentially CTV hasn't been encumbered by that because it's never been a cookie-based environment. So it's almost an opportunity to take the best of what you were doing before, but not be tied down just to be able to use a third-party cookie for, audience targeting when people may have questions about, the validity or provenance of that particular audience. Absolutely,
and by no means are we saying move digital budgets into connected TV, but what we are saying is that we can use TV budgets in a much smarter, more interesting way. And the partners that we want to work with and invest with are the people that are making these innovation changes within their product suite.
Okay, thank you. And now, Richard, to you, obviously you can give us this information from a vendor point of view and a very key player in that market, but your background is agency side, so it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I'm going to approach this question more from an agency perspective than anything else, given my background. I mean, obviously, don't disagree with anything that Catherine and Belle said already. I think the build that I'd put on this, speaking to my own experiences, it's really important not to think of CTV in a silo. When we think about identity, I think historically we've often been kind of railroaded down this kind of rabbit hole almost of thinking about cookies in digital web, thinking about device IDs and IDFAs in app, thinking about different forms of identifiers in CTV. And of course, from the perspective of the buyer, I think the most important thing is to look at it holistically, to understand how consumers consume media, not just within a single environment, but potentially across every possible touch point. Because of course, if we think about this ourselves from the perspective of ourselves as consumers, it's not like we behave differently when we switch between devices necessarily. Yes, there are differences in terms of context and in terms of sort of the tactical kind of things that we tend to be doing at that moment in time. But if you think about it in terms of does the individual themselves change in terms of their their appetite to buy a product just because they're watching a show on their TV versus their mobile device versus their iPad? I'd argue not. So one of the things that we have to look for in identity-driven solutions is how do they enable us to build up a picture of what consumers are doing across all those possible touch points, and then to Belle's point, make the best possible media investment decisions as a result.
Great, thanks. So how from the point of view of one of, I guess, the guiding principles behind Chrome deprecating third-party cookies is to stop things like cross-domain tracking. Based on what you've just said, how can the new versions of identity and the potential infrastructure that InfoSum is powering, how can they solve for that by either using a clean room or something to keep clients' data safe, or making sure that users aren't tracked across domain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, our approach to this from an InfoSum perspective is, we enable parties to collaborate with data without the data ever actually being shared. I'm not going to go into the technical details of how that works on the panel today, but it's our belief that the fundamental issues that exist from a regulatory perspective, as far as the use of personal data goes, aren't so much sort of intrinsically related to the abilities or the rights of the parties involved in an advertising transaction to use that data for both the consumer's benefit and their own benefit. It's really more a function of what understanding we're giving the consumer of how their data is being used, and what ability does the consumer have to exert an appropriate degree of control over the use of that data. And I think what we've seen in web-based environments over the last sort of 12-18 months or so is the browser manufacturers basically saying, well, the industry just hasn't done a good enough job over the last decade of giving consumers appropriate levels of control and providing appropriate transparency. So we're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to effectively move the goalposts for the industry. That's not to say that we can't come up with better ways of doing things that I think ultimately create the right balance between the interests of commercial entities, media owners and advertisers on the one hand, with the interests of consumers on the other. And I think the only way for us to create a sustainable future in the long term is to find the appropriate balance between those different between the interests of those different constituencies. And certainly our perspective is that our technology does that very effectively, but there are lots of other approaches that I think will emerge over the next sort of 12-18 months or so that also give the industry kind of a fighting chance of getting things right going forwards, is what I'd say.
I think one thing to add to that, Richard, is that it's not just the web environments, it's also app environments. I mean, Apple's making changes as well. This is a universal industry challenge where we need to do better collectively to find a way to balance the need of the individual with also the need to prove that these investments work and that we are making the right decisions from a media perspective. And there are lots of different solutions out there, and it's almost too early to say in a lot of instances, does one win out over another in terms of that measurement piece. I think it's a case of test and learn over the next 12 to 18 months, like you say, and watch and see what happens rather than trying to make an instant decision and invest too heavily in one solution and not be able to course correct.
I would I agree with your comment about it. Other parties are going to come in along, and you can't make spontaneous decisions about solutions. But I think there does need to be some general forward momentum for the people in the industry actually trying some of these solutions. And I mean, we obviously do work at ITV. We do work with InfoSum, and part of the attraction for that solution was some of the points that you guys have mentioned about it being decentralized, it being highly compliant. But I think advertisers and people like ourselves who have data, we need to have the comfort that we can trust the parties. I don't think you can go and test everybody. There needs to be some consolidation to a certain extent of trustworthy, compliant manners, because otherwise you end up with even more silos of data sharing, from an advertiser perspective. And if you think about how the IAB serves, the transparency framework, there's so many different options of different vendors. From a consumer experience, that is really quite painful. Are they really giving clear notice about who's using their data or what? So I think we need to try and have some strong partners that we can test and prove work to enable the industry to actually move forward and start sharing data in a compliant manner with common goals to get to the outcomes, or it could take us even longer to get to those preferred outcomes and prove the value of the solutions and advertising on devices like connected TV.
And I think you've just hit the nail on the head in terms of the crux that we have with some of our client challenges, is that they're going to have legacy tech systems and infrastructure in place, and actually having multiple investments across lots of different data infrastructures and data technologies that are very differentiated or separated from the solutions that publishers are coming up with can provide a lot of challenge. And it's kind of our role as agencies and media partners to really help the clients then understand the value of one solution over another, or how they could work in parallel, but equally making sure that everything ties back to that business value. And one of the things I think really, really crucially is, does it add incremental value back into the budget relative to the effort required to deploy some of the solutions and the cost of deploying the solutions? We know that connected TV buying solutions are slightly more expensive as they are. And then when you have an investment of a technology cost over the top, that cost can then exponentially grow. And well, why would I not just buy mass reach as the flip side? Because it's easier, and two, I reach way more people. So yes, I may have some inefficiency there, but I'm going to get a halo effect from that in terms of moving my brand metrics up.
I think that's a really good point. And there's a build that I put on top of that, which is it's not just legacy investment in technology, it's also legacy expectations that are set based on the kinds of media that you've worked with historically. So the interesting thing about CTV, of course, is that it has one foot in what you would probably call the sort of the legacy digital world, and one foot in the legacy TV world. And of course, if you come from a TV background, your entire definition of measurement fundamentally is built around panels. Barb is the gold standard, really, in terms of how you quantify certainly the delivery of a TV campaign, if not so much the effectiveness of a TV campaign. Whereas if you come from the digital world, measurement is all about tracking individual consumers, not just in terms of the delivery, but in terms of the outcomes that you create. So of course, depending on the background of the individuals involved in a CTV buy, they may have very different expectations in terms of how they're going to measure media, how they're going to target consumers, how they're going to quantify effectiveness. And I think, to Belle's point, it's almost the case now that we're entering an entirely new era of media, and we have to sort of wash away all of those old preconceptions that we have in terms of how to do things and almost start afresh. And this, speaking as a digital guy, first and foremost, it's as much for people like me to recognize that, the old way of doing things, tracking each individual consumer, or at least having the idea that we were tracking each individual consumer, like that's not going to exist going forwards, at least not in the form that we were used to. And yes, there'll be, panel-based techniques that become extremely valuable in the sort of the legacy digital world going forwards. I think the key is to find, the perfect balance of different techniques in order to give us the right combination of capabilities and outputs going forward.
I think interestingly on your point there around like the measurement techniques, I would also argue econometrics is like a really old school methodology of measurement, and it doesn't necessarily pick up micro impacts. And so if we're then having to change like all of our measurement solutions at the same time as we're trying to move all of our technology solutions, and we also have all of this regulatory control and browser control coming in, it can be really, really overwhelming for clients. And I think what I would say as a result of that is, like, again, going back to my point earlier, is don't react immediately just because there's new functionality, new capability. Really go back to the business fundamentals. What are you trying to achieve? Why are you trying to achieve it? Making sure that you tie it back into that long-term strategy, because I think because there's so much change in the industry, it can be so easy to be overwhelmed. But if you have those guiding principles, you can then put in that roadmap. Who are going to be the key partners to work with? Who are going to be the key solutions that we test? And then we can go into those other solutions. Like we're mentioning a lot of change here, and that I feel is going to be overwhelming for some people.
That's a really good point, Belle. So how are you kind of managing that on behalf of clients? Do you find that they're coming to you having seen the press and read some great, seen some great marketing saying, I've heard about this kind of solution, clean rooms as an example, we'd like to spend some money there? Or are they really just seeking your advice and then taking on board the consultancy that you give them?
I think it's a combination of both, right? And it depends how tech savvy our clients are. A lot of them are on transformation journeys, whilst others are very, very much at the early infancy of how they change, how they work. A lot is reactionary. Press well can be detrimental in terms of people speculating what's going to happen. I think where we try and come in and advise is going again back to your fundamental business basics of what are you trying to achieve, why are you trying to achieve it, and then us really working in trust, going back to what revenue figures are we trying to achieve, how much budget do we want to put against each channel, and what are our benchmarks for success, making sure that we still use our like base plans of what we know works, and then make sure that we have a testing budget over the top. I think also when we talk around like the tech consultancy piece is, again, chunking things up into more manageable pieces, like tackling the immediate announcements of what you need to change, and then having all the long-term stuff on that back burner, so you still make progress, but you don't get overwhelmed by having to do everything all at once.
Great. Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the next question. We've already identified some of the challenges that are involved here. It is complex. Potentially there is a lot of change in the way that marketers need to think about how they're spending. But what kind of other challenges are there when we're talking about identity and reworking identity for CTV? Catherine, would you like to start that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already touched on a few things about the privacy side of it. And for us, it's really important that because consumers are getting bombarded with, the usage for their data, and they're becoming more aware of data, usage, we need to be sure we're transparent. And so it's all very well us saying, we're transparent to our registered users, but it's not just us that needs to take responsibility for that. We allow them, users, to control their preferences, but it's got to be really clear so they know what that process is and what they're changing. But when you look at especially in the connected TV space, it's really critical that transparency and that link to the consumers is actually maintained throughout all the distribution partners that we work with. It's a really complex partnership ecosystem when you look at the distribution of content onto CTV. It's not a direct to consumer interface all the way, because you're going into the TV manufacturers or through the additional devices. So for us, it's the challenge is the ecosystem actually. And you touched on earlier how we've got an ambition that Planet V will start to allow some clarity in that process, and try and cut through some of that so that advertisers can see a single user across those different distribution mechanisms, across the different, the different media content. You mentioned Samsung being the first one to come onto that, and we're really excited about that. The biggest challenge we're going to have is identity is now for us growing outside of just ITV's view of the connected TV consumer into that broader consumption and that complex ecosystem. And Belle mentioned linear already as well. I'd really echo, you can't just suddenly take everything out of linear. That's doing a superb job, particularly for brand building and mass reach. But you need to look at, as linear becomes addressable, that identity solution is just another part of that ongoing challenge, solving that. And that's something that we, as part of the broader TV industry, are actively working on. And it's complex, and we're not going to solve it immediately. 2021 will see change, but I think I'd echo Belle's point really about you've got to take baby steps. You can't suddenly try and wait for everything to click together. It's not going to be simple like that. But all we can try and do is focus on the transparency and the clarity for consumers and make it as best possible experience and work as collaboratively as we can within the TV industry with our other media partners, like we're trying to do.
Okay, thanks. And continuing on from that, and question for you, Richard, I guess for every ITV, which is a very well-established broadcaster with a logged-in environment, what about the challenge for those media owners who don't have that sort of first-party data? Your CEO, when he's been talking more generically about the internet overall, has said he thought maybe it will balance out at about 20% logged in versus 80% anonymous data. Is that an issue for CTV as well? And what do you think we as an industry can do to help that?
No, I don't think it really is an issue for CTV, being honest. I think that the huge advantage that the CTV ecosystem has right now relative to the legacy web ecosystem, certainly and arguably other forms of digital, is the proportion of the consumer base that is authenticated. I think this is where in the UK, we're potentially in a slightly different situation to some other markets. But when I look myself at the services that I routinely consume content through, which is all the major CTV platforms, I can't think of a single one of those platforms that doesn't force me to authenticate today in order to access content. You can argue that there are some sort of smaller, maybe second, third tier services that you can access today, through smart TV apps that don't require you to authenticate. But I would say the vast majority of the inventory that's kind of most appealing to buyers right now is authenticated inventory, and that allows us to take a fundamentally different approach to identity-driven advertising versus where we maybe would be if we were talking about authentication rates in the 10-20% range. Is that going to remain the case for CTV going forwards? I think it's really hard to tell. It's hard to say how the space is going to evolve, whether we're going to see significant additional entrants in terms of new sources of inventory, and that may well change the nature of the situation going forwards. I think what's likely going to be the case, if I think more broadly speaking about media holistically going forwards, is we will have a parallel set of techniques in future as far as identity-driven advertising goes. We'll have a set of techniques for the authenticated world, which are going to be largely a continuation of the way that we've thought about true sort of individual level addressability historically, albeit with a much greater focus on privacy centricity and privacy by design. And then I think we'll have a very different set of techniques that we use for the unauthenticated ecosystem going forwards. And frankly, that's the area where I think we've probably got the biggest blind spot right now as an industry. We don't really have that figured out. We're not really sure how we're going to solve that problem of effectively communicating all of those consumers who choose not to authenticate for whatever reason.
Okay. I think I have a slightly different viewpoint to that, potentially more from a brand side and an agency side, in that even though that people are largely authenticated on connected TV, we struggle to match from a brand's customer base into a media publishing space. like a 30 to 40% match is seen as a good percentage match. So you then have 60 to 70% of your customers that you can't identify or reach. So we kind of talk about it in you've got 3 layers of internet or connected TVs or connected devices, really, which is your matched ecosystem where a brand can identify a customer to serve a relevant ad, where we need to use publisher or partner data to kind of identify, and we have some level of signal, but we can't tie that back to an individual customer. And then the unauthenticated internet, where we don't really have very much sort of identity signals, but we do have contextual signals around, like in the connected TV space, it will be around the programming, the scheduling, the time of day, some of the regionalization aspects of it as well. So I think, again, within the overview of all of that, within buying of media, creative becomes super, super important, right? It's being able to tailor the message differentially dependent on how much you know and how much data is being given to you with permissions from customers as well. And I think as customers become more empowered and people using the internet understand fundamentally how their data is being used, what do we do differently, and things like that, and opt in and opt out accordingly, we'll start to see that those that want to see the personalized ads do opt in, those that don't opt out, and therefore we need to speak to them in a different way. I think Nielsen did some really great research into, like, there's 4 different profiles of internet users. I think this was last year or the year before. And you have like one segment that just really don't want to be talked to in a really personalized way. And so we should tailor our messaging accordingly in that space where we have that unidentifiable internet space. And if the connected TV needs to move to that direction to accommodate for those users who really don't want to give permissions, they should look to do that through creative solutions.
Good point. Okay, listen, we are now slightly over time, so let's end with, if we go around the panel and give one tip to either agencies, brands, vendors to help drive investment in CTV for this year. So I'll start with you, Catherine.
I would say broadcaster VOD is a perfect environment to test CTV, because you can do some of those smaller tactical evolving experiments using some of this addressability, the developments we've been talking about, you know, try a more refined audience, try and bring in your customer data. Yes, it's not going to be your full campaign plan, as Bill says, but you can get great learnings on different objectives, and, you know, try and prove the value to your brand for that premium spend that you might have on a big screen viewing on CTV. So test.
Right, so tip, use BVOD. Okay, Richard,
any
tip from you?
I'm going to avoid saying use in for some. I think my recommendation is, you know, kind of building on what I said earlier on, be open-minded and be creative about the techniques you use to create value from CTV going forwards. So don't be encumbered by the thinking of the past. Think creatively about how you can leverage the full range of capabilities that are available to you to do effective targeting in CTV, to effectively measure CTV as well in a way that arguably gives you a better way than you maybe would have done historically with digital media or with TV. Think of it as almost the perfect hybrid between those two worlds. That's my advice.
Great, thanks. And finally, Belle?
And my advice would be considered with what you are trying to achieve. Always go back to that fundamental, what are you trying to achieve with this? Just because something's cool doesn't mean that you should do it. It should drive that meaningful business impact. And you should always go back to that when choosing a solution or something to test.
Great, thank you very much. Well, that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Catherine, Belle, and Richard. Thanks for your insight. Seems like we could have talked a lot longer on this subject. And thank you very much, New Video Frontiers.